CIPR headquarters and CIPR Public Affairs Group event. It is going to be a fascinating and fantastic discussion. So I'm glad you are with us. I'm Rachel Clamp, the chair of the Public Affairs Group at CIPR and your chair for today's event. It is an absolute privilege to be chairing this event, and we have some incredible guests. So we have Dame Angela Eagle MP, Member of Parliament for Wallasey. We have Dr. Hannah White, Deputy Director for the Institute for Government. Jivan Sander, economist at King's College London and former Treasury official, and Duncan Hames, Director of Policy at Transparency International UK and a former Member of Parliament for Chippenham. Panellists, thank you so much again for joining. It's going to be a great discussion, and thank you for being with us. Before we get stuck into things, I have a couple of housekeeping things to go through. First of all, if you are a CIPR member, don't forget to register today's event on your CPD record. Then also, for everybody, if you can please use the chat to ask questions to the panel or to maybe post a comment. You can please do so throughout. You can post at any time, but we won't be coming until Q&A until after we've heard from all panelists. What we are also going to pop in the chat are the handles for everybody that is on Twitter handles, in case you want to tweet about today's event. And if any of you are unsure about posting something in the chat for a question, you can DM me on Twitter and I will try and ask that as well. But that does mean I will have 4 screens running, so chat if you can. So kicking things off then, CIPR has been critical of the Transparency and Lobbying Non-Party Campaigning and Trade Union Administration Act 2014 since it was introduced. As it's our opinion, it is not fit for purpose due to its narrow scope. As we all know, the Act requires only a small proportion of lobbyists to register. This results in the public unable to access meaningful and accurate information about lobbying, which was the intent of the Act. The public are calling for greater scrutiny. Research published by the CIPR, which was conducted quite early in the year, shows that 2/3 of adults feel the public should know more about lobbyists seeking to influence MPs and ministers. It's the CIPR's view that the register should be expanded to capture all lobbying activity that includes oral, written or electronic communication with ministers, MPs, regional mayors, senior civil servants and special advisors, regardless of who is undertaking it. Simply put, it should be a register of lobbying rather than lobbyists. This means that the lobbying activities of consultant lobbyists, businesses, charities, trade unions and think tanks will require registration. But what could this mean for those that we lobby? And let's not forget that those that we lobby are the people that will be passing the new legislation. So we need to be engaging with them in a transparent and constructive manner. Subjects that I hope we're going to be covering off today could include, do we need fundamental change and will they be accepted? What could or should be included in future legislation? If it's too tight, will that create loopholes? If it is too broad, will it capture anything that is anything that is meaningful? Should we consider a roadmap of lobbying transparency, changes that can unfold over several years with milestones and flexibility to adapt to the future? Is it a holistic view that's needed? What concerns actually need to be addressed, and are they just come from lobbying? And finally, is there a lack of public awareness by the general public that needs to be addressed, so that lobbying, in whichever form by whoever it's undertaken, doesn't appear to be a bit dodgy? We're going to start by each of the panelists giving their thoughts, remarks, reflections for a few minutes, and then we're going to pull together a bit more of a broad discussion, and we'll be able to bring your Q&A in, your questions in, sorry. So please remember, use the chat or DM me on Twitter, and then we can have a really rich discussion. Angela, if I can come to you first. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and it's a pleasure to join the panel at this event. I think lobbying itself is one of those elastic concepts which many different people mean very different things when they talk about. As somebody who's been actively involved in democratic politics for, well, since I was 16 when I joined the Labour Party, but has been holding public office, i.e. there to be lobbied, for nigh on 30 years now, some lobbying can be extremely helpful and effective, and much of it can be. It's part of the democratic flow of information which comes about, particularly when you have a constituency link. I visit my local businesses all the time. I go to schools, I go to public services, I go to community groups, I visit and engage with trade union branches, all representing particular interests that want to make me aware of things that are going on in the constituency, of issues that worry them, of things that might be getting in the way of them having a smooth running of whatever it is they're doing. And I fully expect to be informed and kept in the loop about those things. It makes me a better representative of my own local area, particularly the constituency link. And it also makes me much better informed. So, for example, when I was in the Treasury and I was suddenly made responsible for all the vices in the country, taxing them more accurately, I had to make sure I went around and listened to what people were saying. So I visited some very interesting casinos. I talked to people who were producing whiskey. I talked to those at the border who were trying to prevent the smuggling of stuff that purported to be whiskey but wasn't into the country. Same with cigarettes, bingo, and all of those kinds of things. All of that informed me about what the issues were in the particular thing I was doing at the time. And you don't have to be a genius to work out if somebody's coming at you with a particular interest in mind. You do need to be able to discern what is self-interested and what is more objective, and then you use your own judgment, applying your own values, applying the values of the party that you represent, for your view of society. What, for example, is vice worth taxing? What can we do with the taxes that we get from these things? Cigarettes? Well, with cigarettes and cigars, the idea of the tax was to try to discourage people from actually being addicted to those substances because of the health reasons. It wasn't to maximize the tax take. With gambling, we were worried about online harms, particularly with offshoring of gambling. And there were policy issues about how high the taxes that applied in the country would be, and would that actually drive everything offshore where it was completely out with any kind of legal control. So there are all sorts of issues that come at you, and you have to be open and upfront about how you make decisions and why you've made decisions in these areas. And as I say, just giving those examples, I hope people will understand. What is unacceptable with lobbying is if it's done in secret, without it being transparent, and it leads to changes of policy which were done in the dark. Especially if money is changing hands, that can get close to corruption. So we have to distinguish what we mean about lobbying. That's the first thing. The current structure of our lobbying law is completely and utterly unbalanced. As we've seen with the Greensill scandal, it didn't stop what David Cameron did. And remember that David Cameron stood to gain a great deal of money indeed, had his lobbying for Greensill succeeded and allowed that company to survive the coronavirus pandemic. We still don't know quite how Greensill Capital managed to access £400 million of public money via the British Business Bank when they had applied for a completely different scheme. We don't know how much money that miscalculation cost. We don't know how much damage has been done by the collapse of Greensill in terms of the public purse. But because of some doughty investigative journalism, we do know what that sort of, well, I described it as more like stalking than lobbying. We do know that it went on. Had that journalism not gone on, we would have known nothing about what was going on with senior civil servants, texting the Chancellor, bothering everybody that he still had a phone number for in government. Quite improper. So transparency is a huge issue. I would be very wary of creating all lobbying and treating all lobbying as if it's the same. We have to get a definition, because you can drown yourself out in paper. If we look at, for example, the money laundering regulations at the moment, I think Hamlet would say that they actually are noticed more in the breach than the observance. Banks are so defensive about what they think might be dodgy goings on that they register tens of hundreds of thousands of suspicious transactions to such an extent that nobody can actually investigate any of them. So you've got a gigantic list of suspicious transactions and no activity going on to check whether they were okay. I think if we're not careful, we would be in exactly the same situation with registering lobbying. So let's define what we mean by lobbying. Let's get away from the idea that all lobbying is bad. Some of it is extremely good. Lobbying for money, or if somebody's got an interest in the outcome or is being paid to have an interest in the outcome with share options and various other things, presents different issues. So transparency and proper proportionality. And my final comment is the current law that we are working under was deliberately designed to be ineffective, to allow the kind of lobbying that David Cameron has done, merely to catch those that have an expertise in lobbying and do it for multiple clients. But it was also, and much more importantly, designed to gag charities and trade unions in the run-up to general elections, and it has done that very effectively. So that piece of legislation was misnamed. It was highly partisan. It was to prevent the National Union of Students from harassing Lib Dem MPs in their constituencies, and I can see Duncan laughing, but it was. And it was also to make it even more hard for trade unions to do what they traditionally do, which is be a collective voice for people in the workforce. It didn't recognise the unique situation that we have in this country with those unions, not all of them, that are affiliated to the Labour Party and helped to form it. It was partisan, and it should never have been called the Lobbying Act. It should have been called what I called it when I opposed it from the front bench in opposition, a gagging act.
Angela, thank you so much for your remarks, opening remarks. I think plenty there for everyone to follow up with, and also I'm hoping for people to be asking more questions. Hannah, we can come to you now, please.
Thanks very much, Rachel, and good to hear your remarks as well, Angela. So my sort of locus in relation to all this is from various different angles. So I worked for 10 years as a clerk in the House of Commons, and then I moved to run the Committee on Standards in Public Life in the Cabinet Office before I came to the Institute. And so I've sort of got a perspective from the point of view of someone inside Parliament, working with lots of MPs. I've got the point of view from someone who's worked as a sort of regulator, sort of watchdog type perspective. And now at the Institute, we try to think about issues of ethical standards really from the point of view of, you know, what makes government effective and work well. And it's interesting for us in some ways because, you know, some of these discussions about how you define lobbying, well, you know, the Institute is a lobbyist in some senses, in that, you know, we have things to government. We're very open about that, and we put on our website everything that we think should change in government, and we have meetings with with ministers about that. And, I think we would be totally open to declaring those if the law changed, because there's nothing, in anything that we do that is secret or that we gain any benefit from, other than the sight, hopefully, of government working more effectively. I totally agree with what Angela said about the value of lobbying. Lobbying is really important. We don't want a set of politicians or other decision makers, sitting in Westminster and Whitehall, working purely on the basis of their own prior experience and their assumptions and their prejudices. We want lots of access from all different people to decision makers, so that they can gain the value of that sort of knowledge and all the information they can't possibly have on the multiplicity of issues that they are required to deal with in their sort of daily lives. So, lobbying, as you sort of said at the beginning, Rachel, it shouldn't be seen as something which is inherently bad. And that's definitely something we want to move away from. I'm really interested to hear the sort of proposals from CIPR about lobbying and how we change things potentially from the point of view of the lobbyists. What we've thought about more from the Institute for Government's point of view, as you might expect, is from the point of view of those who are lobbied, and how we can make sure that the process of them being lobbied is as transparent as possible. Because again, I agree with Angela that the way to make sure that this isn't happening, privately in a way that only investigative journalists can find out about, is to make sure that those transparency mechanisms are really working. So we've thought about this from the point of view of ministers and civil servants, senior civil servants, and thought about the mechanisms that they have that shape what they are required to do in terms of declaring the meetings they may have and the other sort of forms of communication they may have. And I think that's perhaps something we might explore later in the session, is, when people sort of started to think about how to regulate lobbying, perhaps there weren't the multiplicity of electronic means of communication that there are today. And what is expected, I think, in terms of, do you declare that WhatsApp you received? Are things which it's really important that ministers, civil servants have clarity on, because it's not it's not necessarily obvious to them, and so we need to make sure the rules are really clear. So the IFG published a report recently, and we had 3 sets of recommendations. One were around the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, ACABA, which is this body which I think lots more people have heard now than they had sort of a couple of months ago. But it's the body that gives advice to former civil servants and ministers on what jobs they should take up. But it's really quite toothless. But its purpose is to try to avoid any perception of undue influence, inappropriate influence, but it doesn't really have any powers to enforce that. So we have talked about ways in which you might give it greater powers to apply financial penalties, and a longer ban on former ministers and civil servants taking certain jobs, rather than there just being a kind of, well, we'll write you a stern letter which you can ignore if you feel like it. We've also got some recommendations about the ministerial code, how that could be strengthened by giving it statutory backing, and that would strengthen, I think, the protections around what ministers can and can't do. There's some thoughts around the role of the Prime Minister's independent advisor on the ministerial code. The government tweaked the terms of reference for that role when they appointed Lord Geit, who's the new a person performing that role, but really didn't go far enough, we don't think, and they should have given the advisor the power to independently initiate investigations, not just to tell the Prime Minister that he would like to do an investigation, but to be able to just go ahead and do that. And I think that would do a lot to improve the sort of sense of independence around the administration of the ministerial code. And then we've got some recommendations around the civil service code and the wider rules. And we think, we need to tighten the rules around civil servants having outside interests. There was a lot of discussion about civil servants with second jobs. We need to tighten those, make sure those rules are really clear and again, transparent, and make sure that rules on financial interests also include special advisors and other czars and people in sort of who are appointed by government to do certain jobs. We need to make sure that those sorts of roles, the same requirements of transparency around their interests should apply. So encourage you to go and look at that. Perhaps I'll put the link to that report in the chat, and very happy to answer any questions on it. And I look forward to hearing what Jeevan and Duncan have to say.
Great, thanks very much, Hannah. I think you're very much some of the things that the findings of your report, I think, yes, if we can put that in the chat, I think everyone would appreciate that. But also just thinking about one of the points raised about are we looking at more of a holistic view? Do we need to start in a very different place, or and look at it in its entirety, and lobbying is just the access point initially? Jeevan, can we come to you, please?
Yeah, please. And it's great to hear from Andrew and Hannah. That was really fascinating stuff to hear. So as they covered, I'm Jeevan. I'm an economist at King's, a former Treasury official, and I've also worked as an economist in Somaliland for a few years. And today I'm going to talk about kind of principles behind lobbying and when it works well for those who are lobbied and the public, and in particular, its impact on policy outcomes and economic growth. And really, when lobbying works best is when it helps groups share information with the government about the impacts of policy and their views on it. Because what it does do, lobbying, is it helps to solve information problems. Policymakers and politicians, they're not omnipotent, disinterested automatons sitting in ivory towers who know all the information, know what the best course of action is. When I was in the Treasury, there were around 1,000 civil servants at that time. Probably around 400 ended up working on policy. There's no way those 400 civil servants would know the details of all the policies that were to be implemented. I mean, they had to recommend to the Chancellor what would be funded. In one sense, they ended up recommending what would be implemented. And when it comes to niche policy interests in particular, they simply don't know or don't have the information to hand. Will increased standards on tractors lead to environmental degradation and farmer bankruptcy? How much does it actually cost to increase quality childcare provision? So governments do need lobbies, and they do need lobbyists to inform them. They need information to pass to governments. They need to also hear from people affected by policies. They need to know what their views are. Ministers need to know that information. They need to know when interests clash, they need to make decisions after it. But there is also a time when lobbying, it doesn't lead to better policy making. And we've seen that in the recent past, as when lobbying starts to promote a private interest, persons and businesses, and also when we see politicians personally benefiting from that private interest for their own gain. And that second bit is really, really important, because while the former Prime Minister lobbying for Greensill was unedifying and unseemly, for a group that would of course has gone bankrupt and was possibly fraudulent, David Cameron didn't in the end get what he wanted. And the reason for that in part is because there didn't seem to be a huge interest in the Chancellor granting that loan or pushing for it to be granted to him. But there are other examples where ministers have stood to gain and where we have seen private interests get what they want by lobbying. We saw Robert Jenrick, the Tory donor, miss out in £45 million of taxation payments after, Richard Desmond missed out on those taxation payments after successfully lobbying Robert Jenrick. We don't know what the donors who funded Boris Johnson's flat refurbishment wanted. And this is where we should really be worried, because this isn't really also just about taxpayer money being wasted by government. When this kind of lobbying takes hold, when decision-making is about who you know rather than what you know, or even the people you represent, it makes us all poorer, and it starts to lead to economic stagnation. Because when individual people and companies are drawing up policies and laws and regulations, they're restricting access to others from entering markets. They're reducing competition. They're increasing their own profits. That leads to higher prices. It leads to lower growth. It leads to less welfare. It directs money from those who need it to those who can get it. And today, when we look across the world in low-income nations, that's exactly the kind of lobbying we see. We see personalized policy making, policies made for individual people and companies. They get what they want because they pay who's in power. That subverts policy outcomes. It leads them in a low-income development trap. And when you think even to the broad sweep of history, one of the reasons why the United Kingdom was the first to industrialize and see sustained economic growth in the 18th century is precisely because policy making was less personalized. Now, look, after the Glorious Revolution, Parliament was by no means democratic, but it did represent a broader swathe of society. It could now be petitioned effectively by interest groups. And in particular, they represented an asset manufacturing sector. They could tell Parliament what they needed to thrive. They would set the foundation for prosperity. That lobbying that allowed for information to pass through, that lobbying that allowed for the representation of interest and ensured that policymaking wasn't just made by those in power or those close to it, helped free Britain from the grip of extreme poverty. If we look at the same time by contrast, absolutist Spain, a superpower of the 16th century that threatened the minnow that was the United Kingdom with its armada, would go into decline precisely because its laws and policies were personalized and it represented only the interests of a few who were close to the monarchy at that time. And I think today the problem in the UK is we face is that the UK government is vulnerable to that precise type of personalized policy making. It's typified by the Green Sill affair, as well as the Richard Desmond affair and the Prime Minister's flat. And I think, you know, as has been mentioned before, given the current rules where people vote once every 5 years, and when lobbying isn't a salient political issue, then prime ministers who are less scrupulous can simply ignore the standards and rules of public life. And we've seen that today. The prime minister is responsible for enforcing the ministerial code, as well as deciding who's in breach of it. So there's a clear conflict of interest when it concerns their own ministers, but especially when it comes to investigations into themselves. The Boardroom Review currently only looks at the Green Sill affair in isolation, but hasn't had its terms of reference widened to consider other lobbying scandals, such as the Generic affair or even the Prime Minister's flat, as well as the rules need to stop such policy making in the future. So yeah, proposals that would put the power to investigate breaches without the direction of the Prime Minister are entirely the correct ones to go forward. It's also unclear when ministers meet and communicate with other groups. And I would echo those earlier comments about the need to see all types of communication, including electronic communication between ministers and former ministers or other groups as well. We also need to be assured, by the way, that freedom of information requests are only being rejected when it's appropriate to do so. And the final point I really want to make is that the UK is vulnerable to this type of personalised lobbying because power is so concentrated in whichever party has a majority, and where their only major constraint is public opinion at the next election, and where voters tend to vote upon whether or not their lives are better, whether or not they themselves have become better off, rather than what can seem like quite esoteric concerns over the quality of government. You know, at the end of it all, power concentrated is power poorly wielded. And one thing we haven't really discussed yet is how likely recommendations here are likely to be implemented. No election is going to be won on lobbying legislation, and it could be overturned by future governments. I think Angela made a really important point about the Transparency Act and the problems therein. And so really, we should also be looking at the mechanisms that set up our policy-making rules. And that does include constitutional reform, where we have an elected second chamber that can amend lobbying legislation as well as hold the majority of the Commons to account. It'd be a more effective mechanism for democratic accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeevan. And Duncan, now come to you for comments, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Jeevan, for that really good summary of why we need to be wary of Britain descending into a kind of patrimonial style of government. It's great to have this discussion today. Thank you, Rachel. You and I were lobbying a government minister earlier this year as part of the post-legislative review of the Lobbying Act, which is something that the government embarked on after it was urged to do so by Greco, which is an organization in the Council of Europe, which Britain is still in, which reviews the health and strength of democracies amongst its members and their protections, amongst other things, against corruption in their government. And the focus of that review is on part 1 of the Lobbying Act, which Angela described the full breadth of. And part 1 relates to lobbying and established the Consultant Lobbyist Register. Our view at Transparency International is that the Lobbying Act has, and the register as we currently have it, is totally inadequate for the purpose of shining a light on how lobbying takes place, on how decisions in government that are made in our name are influenced. And your question before us today is to ask, what could be the impact on the lobbied of changes? Well, I mean, my first concern is that there may not be very much in the way of changes coming, and I certainly encourage Dame Angela here and her colleagues to keep up the pressure for that. But we're already hearing a degree of confidence amongst some of the government's MPs that the attention on this issue is successfully kicked into the long grass. So, we believe we do need changes, and I'll set out briefly a summary of the changes that we want. And we've been arguing for those in the course of this post-legislative review, but I'm not optimistic. I think what we're likely to get, if we get anything at all, will be changes that don't require primary legislation, that are about improving the way the current system operates rather than addressing its fundamental weaknesses. Welcome, but nonetheless very modest changes, such as increasing the depth, if you like, of decision makers in government whose lobbying might require you to register if you are a consultant lobbyist. Changes like improving the scope of officials and aides in government whose ministerial diaries get published, the list of their external meetings, and possibly improvements to what is currently really tardy release of information under the government's transparency measures. We've just added 2,000 new government meetings to our database, which I'll post a link later, our open access platform, which frankly does the job that we rather wish government did for itself, which is to take all of its various PDF files that it publishes roughly quarterly, detailing who government ministers have been meeting, and puts them in an easily accessible place for journalists and citizens alike to interrogate, to find out what meetings have been taking place. Those declarations are often very obscure and obtuse. They don't describe very well what the nature of the meeting was, what the purpose of the lobbying might have been, and it is inexplicable really why government thinks it's acceptable to release that information in the most recent case over 200 days after the last of those meetings. So the most recent set of meetings the government releases is for the end of 2020. So there are a lot of small tweaks where you might expect there to be some changes, and that could make a difference for some of the professional lobbyists on this call in terms of whether they might need to join the register when they currently don't. But the fact of the matter is we need much more wholesale change. We do need in-house lobbyists, people like myself and you, Rachel, but also people like David Cameron, people working for corporates, not for professional consultant lobbyist outfits, to be required to register our activities in the register, as you've been calling for. I think need that register to be one that captures meaningful information about the nature of those lobbying campaigns. But I do agree with Angela that we are never going to get transparency over these things where I think the public have a right to know if we don't have some kind of reasonable de minimis level whereby some lobbying activity doesn't need to be declared, because lobbying is something that arguably every citizen does when they engage with politicians. If we're not careful, then Aunt Sally arguments will be used not by Angela, but by those who don't want to see reforms to stop us from getting a more meaningful lobbying register. Now, the thing is, we're not doing this on our own. countries across the democratic world are grappling with this issue. Someone helpfully posted in the chat earlier the OECD report, which has been published today. You know, there are much better models that we could point to and learn from in terms of greater transparency, and they do work. And I'd point in particular to Ireland and Canada in that respect. Very interestingly, and no doubt you'll want to talk about, you know, digital developments later. We learned from Canada that there was a 40% increase in registrants on their lobbying register last year because of the way that digital communications had, in terms of the criteria on their register, made it easier for more people to be engaging in the kind of lobbying that they needed to declare. And that was welcomed as a sign of greater compliance. So there is very little light being shed on this at the moment, and a lot more needs to be done. But I fear, just as we've seen in all sorts of other areas of trying to reform for standards in public life, that it requires the political heat of the public's reaction to scandal to really force change, and that it's far from certain that we'll get the changes that you might be anticipating at the moment.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, all panelists. You come back with a few questions, just pulling back on things that you said, but just a reminder to everybody that is watching, please put your questions in the chat or DM me if you want to be anonymous. I think you can select being anonymous in there. One thing that I wanted to pull out, a number of you mentioned, is we were talking about, and Duncan, you were just doing it as well, about the lobbying or lobbyists registering versus the, and it's particularly in your area, the diary. Where does that responsibility lie? Where is the balance of responsibility? I think that's one of the things that we as lobbyists are really interested in knowing. There's one degree that, and we've all, as we've seen, there are, as a lobbying industry, and you've seen this when you and I were in the round table, there's myself and Francis Ingham, we were saying, we have lobbyists that want to register. We've got people signing up to voluntary registers. Over the last couple of months of the Green Seal instance, we've had everybody that's been out there, CIPR, individuals, PRCA, been saying, people want to register. That's what people want. We want better transparency. So where does this fit then? Where's the balance of responsibility on and where the information goes, and for those that are lobbying and those are being lobbied? I'm going to come to you first, Duncan, because you're still on my screen and this is your world, and then I'm going to come to Angela after on that, if that's okay.
Thank you, Rachel. I think we do need both parties to the lobbying conversation to play that part, or at least targeted groups of both sides of that conversation where it's proportionate. So, I mean, Angela talked about many of the kind of conversations that she would have where she was being lobbied as an MP, and also those where one might be lobbied as a government minister, and where you have a civil service and you have a well-resourced office, that the ability to keep proper declarable records is rather different, and where you're a government minister and you're making decisions on behalf of the public, and you have some executive authority in many respects, the case for taking some responsibility to bring this information to the public domain is stronger. So it needs to be proportionate, but I do think there's benefit in it happening on both sides, that the professional lobbyists, whether they are consultant lobbyists or lobbying for a private interest or some other professional interested capacity, should be being open about the nature of their lobbying campaigns, and those that are making decisions on our behalf ought to be declaring the lobbying they've received. And one of the benefits of that is that, frankly, as we've seen, there are huge holes in the transparency disclosures. If a party in government holds a conference at which they have a business day, and they sell tables at an event at that business day to businesses and lobbyists, and they promise to put a cabinet minister on each table, and maybe rotate those cabinet ministers round tables through the course of the event. Every single one of those lobbying conversations that happen with those ministers at that event is excluded from government meetings declarations, because the argument is made that that they're not having those meetings in a government capacity. If that's not cash for access, if that's not the sort of thing that we should be concerned about giving lobbying a bad name, then I don't know what is. But at the moment, the public know very little about what goes on in those circumstances. But I've been to conferences and heard businesses boasting about the access that they've had to cabinet ministers as a result of paying to take part in those kind of activities.
Angela, can we ask on your thoughts on where does the balance of responsibility sit across the lobbied and the lobbyists?
Well, I think it's different if money's changing hands than if you're just getting information. And I think if money's changing hands, we ought to have a system whereby that is properly registered. And I think it's quite fragmented at the moment because we've got the electoral laws, and we've then got the government, and as a minister you have different sort of decision-making capacity. I do think we ought to, I think there's a lot of chaff thrown up when stuff like this comes up, particularly by the current party which is in office, if I could put it that way. And that's because they want to make out that if somebody lobbies me as a backbencher, it's somehow as important as if they go to Robert Jenrick and get 140 million quid's worth of easements because of a decision that was then made, for example. So I think we really need to focus on those that have got executive decision-making capacities, and some of them will be elected. And as we've increasingly seen, lobbyists who are trying to do these things behind the scenes in a surreptitious way, who've got financial interests they're pushing, if they can't get to ministers, they'll get to other people that can have an effect on the decision as well. And that is special advisors. It appears increasingly to be, and shockingly in my view, to be senior civil servants as well. And so the only way to deal with all of that is to have transparency about the relationships and transparency about any financial issues so that everybody can check that. So I would say executive decision making is very different. So when Conservative MPs currently say, well, why shouldn't people who talk to the Labour Party be, we don't at the moment, because we're in opposition, have any capacity to make decisions and spend public money in the way that the Tories have been doing, especially in an emergency. I think this has been made worse by the complete breakdown of propriety that's gone on in the pandemic. So now we don't even have any real comfort to think that procurement is being done competitively or against set rules. It's just happening behind the scenes, and the National Audit Office are taking a very close look at some of that. I think we've traditionally been a democracy and a political system that is run by, I mean, it used to be called the good chap rules, didn't it? Where everyone was a good chap, everything was unwritten, and good chaps don't behave in this kind of awful, vulgar way by sort of succumbing to bribery and corruption, if I could put it that way. And the good chap rules have broken down. We've got a leader of the House of Commons who illegally prorogued Parliament because it was, convenient to do so, because he wanted it to be shut up. And he might be a very good chap himself, but didn't behave according to the good chap rules. And so we've now got a system that's increasingly being subverted in all of its unwritten rules by people who are willing and don't seem to have any qualms about disobeying anything, and sort of don't worry about breaking the spirit of the rules if they haven't somehow broken the actual sort of letter of the rules. So in those sorts of circumstances, we have to start setting this stuff down in legislation. The difficulty is there are 164 more Conservative MPs than Labour MPs in the current Parliament. They have a majority of 81, 82. And you cannot expect that when they have been benefiting in the way that they have benefited, that they are willing to ride a coach and horses through all of the unwritten rules, that they're going to present us with a decent bit of legislation which will guard against some of the things that Jivan was talking about in his extremely important observations.
Thank you, Angela. Now, Hannah, if I can come to you, question from Paul Beckford. Should the lobbying register be expanded to include political donors? Just thinking about the way in which you're coming from, or should the laws be amended to limit any amount that an individual can donate?
So I think, I mean, the rules around political donors and political donations are obviously administered by the Electoral Commission. The Committee on Standards in Public Life, actually before my time, did a big piece of work on political funding and made a whole sort of set of recommendations, which they saw as a package, which would have tackled both concerns on the sort of side of parties which tend to get very large donations from one-off sort of individuals and companies, and at the same time concerns there were, about the sort of influence over other parties by sort of large numbers of people making small donations. And they had this package of recommendations which sort of addressed both sides of the coin, and yet that was never taken up, and has been never taken up by any government since, but I think would go a long way towards sort of addressing the concerns there are about the influence of political donors over policies of parties when they're in government and in a position to do something about it, as Angela, the point that Angela's made. So I don't think, I think personally, I think that yes, the lobbying register should be expanded. It's not an easy task, because there is this question of how you define what is lobbying without, every single person who speaks to Angela in the street becoming defined as a lobbyist. But I think it's worth making the effort to work out how to expand that definition of lobbying. If political donors are having meetings and lobbying senior civil servants or ministers on particular issues, then I think that they should be that activity should be recorded on the government minister's side, and that that maybe we can frame a way that the lobbying is defined which would also catch that from the point of view of the register. So I think it's about what the activity is designed to achieve. But I think there is, it's a really interesting question. If somebody gave a donation to the Conservative Party, which was in some way used to help the Prime Minister renovate his flat, what obligations, if the Prime Minister was aware of that, there's a lot of ifs in this, and obviously the impropriety has been denied, but if the Prime Minister was aware of that, how can that not put him under a sense of obligation to the person who has supplied those funds? And so I think it is, it's all, you've got to think in the end about the effect of the money changing hands or the lobbying that's taking place, and what impact that has on the person being lobbied, which is obviously the topic we're talking about today.
And the rules say perception of a conflict of interest. They don't even say there has to be a conflict of interest. And obviously perceptions change. The more cynical people get, that all politicians have got their noses in the trough and all that usual stuff that people say, which is completely untrue. The more people have that cynical perception, the more that the perception of a conflict of interest ought to bite.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Just picking on some of the questions, some of the things that you've all been saying, and some questions that have been coming in. We're talking very much about the definition of lobbying, and then also how to group those people. Angela, you were just touching on the difference between an executive decision maker versus a backbencher versus somebody in government versus the opposition. Some people are talking about the different levels almost of whether you would have the same, Emily Wallace, whether a trade union or charity lobbyist would be classed as equivalent to a corporate or consultant lobbyist. And somebody else has asked similar questions. Sorry, scrolling down furiously. yeah, how distinguishing about the different types with its donors, or and how would that be registered. But so there's all those questions. We've talked about definition. I'd be interested to know, when we're in this environment where we've got those that we lobby and lobbyists, two sides, who determines the definition? Jeevan or Duncan, anybody, do you want to jump in, and any thoughts on this?
Well, if you have an entirely voluntary arrangement, then you're left with people having to decide for themselves, and that's not going to produce, you know, a useful picture of what's happening. Yeah. So I agree. You do need, as Angela puts it, a decent set of rules. You do need definitions, and for those to be clear. But the current scope is just far too narrow. We did an analysis of lobbying on housing policy for a report that we'll be publishing this summer, and we found that fewer than 1% of the meetings that government ministers were declaring about housing policy were with people that had to register as on the Registrar of Consultant Lobbyists, presumably because the other 99% were meetings with people who were having those meetings, you know.
Oh, I think we've lost you, Duncan.
I think Duncan's frozen. Maybe I can come in here. I agree with Duncan that there's a narrow scope at the moment. But again, what is it that you're trying to capture? Because certainly when I was being lobbied about things like that, I think it's very different talking to builders who've got huge builders that have got lots of banked land that are pushing a particular approach to things like building on greenfields because they can make more money, for example, than having rules that would force them to build on brown fields. You know, you're not a fool if you're a minister. You know what the interests that are being lobbied, you're being lobbied about, are with the people that you're being, you know, that you're meeting in general. The issue then is, do the public need to know? And of course they do. You know, that can be reasonable, but it's no good having a partial system. So Duncan, it's great that you've got an online portal of government meetings, but you know, that's not where the problem is. The problem isn't where people are being transparent and open now. It's the people that are doing it in the dark. You know, it's the owners of the property in Mustique. It's, you know, who's paid for the Prime Minister's redecorations and what kind of obligation they're going to be under. We don't even know who those people are. And this has been going on for years. So we don't know what favours are being done. It's all being done in the dark. It increases the cynicism around politics. And therefore, you know, it's no good having rules if the vast majority of what's going on is bypassed by them because they're too narrow. But at the same time, it's no good having to register everything, because then you'll end up with a process that produces lots of information that is of no use whatsoever.
Thanks, Angela.
Very quickly, I did wanted to add to that is, you know, let's take the presumption that whatever the list is going to be, there's going to be someone being missed off it who is going to try and kind of influence policy in a way that we don't really like. And so in that case, actually just more transparency, as has been discussed, so we have a more idea of who is communicating when and where. As to the point where it gets like intrusive towards ministers' private lives is where there starts to come a lot more difficult questions. But certainly knowing more about exactly who is being spoken to and when is probably more, well, certainly an additionally useful thing than also having a register of lobbyists and being the lobby. Because of course it could also be, you know, the friend of a friend who ends up having the private drink in the side. And so really knowing exactly who ministers are meeting and being able to draw a link then between kind of the private outcome or the outcome of legislation and where these meetings are, that to me is like another key aspect we have to start to look at, because there will be, unfortunately, some holes. And
how was it as a senior civil servant? We've talked a lot about ministers. There's been some, we've touched on SPADs. We know that we've seen more discussion around senior civil servants. How was that? And again, it starts to play into the definition piece. Where should that fall, maybe?
Yeah, so I think as Angela has said previously, like you would be lobbied by organizations, but it was done in a way that we would see as being above board and desirable. You know, people would email you with information, you would go to events, you'd also have, of course, a government email account that everyone had access to, a calendar invite that people takes you to, and then finally a piece of policy that was decided upon. And so in that case, it was quite easy for people to see what had happened. Now, had it been the case that I'd, left the Treasury and gone to a private firm that I was once, had dealings with, then yeah, that would also look very suspicious. And maybe there should also be rules around that and where civil servants go after they leave office. And we've certainly seen some problems in that most recent scandal in the Greensill affair.
And that was before WhatsApp and Signal and all of the other more private encrypted messaging services. I mean, certainly we didn't have social media when I was a minister of that sort. So there wasn't those kinds of channels that appear to be being widely used now.
Hannah, did you want to comment?
No, it's fine.
Is that, sorry, I thought I could see Duncan go for his mute button. No. It's harder to chair, isn't it, virtually? Okay, so thank you very much for those answers. Just scooting down some more of the questions. Interesting one from Mandy Pierce, CIPR President 2021. Looking at the area of, we've been talking very much around Westminster. I'm conscious we do also have, so Scotland has different rules, but also just looking at this around lobbying of local government. I think it's one of the things that we're aware of, that's not necessarily captured. With the combined authority mayors, metro mayors, councillors, etc., sitting on quite a bit of public money still. How do we start to look at potentially having some successes and maybe putting some more rigour into local authority lobbying? Has anybody got any thoughts on that? Hannah? I
can come in there. Yeah, I mean, I think this is it's another example of a similar problem around that we see repeatedly, I think, around ethical standards and public life, which is that politicians often like to say, well, at the end of the day, the ballot box is the sanction for bad behaviour. And I was slightly amused by the sight of Eric Pickles, who's now chair of ACABA, sort of on all the media recently talking, about the importance of ACABA's work, when I remembered that he had been the Secretary of State at MHCLG who'd abolished all the standards bodies in local government, and had said, well, at the end of the day, we don't need all this bureaucracy because the ballot box will be the ultimate sanction. And I think that that's just completely disingenuous, because how many people really vote for their local councillor on the basis of whether something may have been reported in a local newspaper about what they may or may have not have done, 4 years previous to the election. And so I think, it is really important to have these sort of standards structures at a local level too. And I mean, obviously it's been drowned out by lots of other stuff that's gone on, but we've seen some really serious things going on in Liverpool this year. And actually, as you say, this is public money, and these are decisions, lots of planning decisions and things where there's tremendous scope, if you look, internationally, for out and out corruption. And I don't know to what extent there's a potential for that in the UK system, because I'm not close enough to it, but it would seem logically that the scope for actual or perceived conflicts of interest, as these codes of conduct tend to phrase it, is tremendous. And it's just the same in terms of people we need people to have confidence in our politicians, and that's the same at local government as it is in central government. And if we've learned anything through the pandemic, it ought to be that how tremendously important it is that people believe what politicians say to them. And if politicians say to them, go and get a vaccination, that they have enough trust in government that they feel confident to go and do that. And if you look around the world at countries which are struggling more with vaccine hesitancy, I think some of that can be attributed to problems of confidence in government. And so all this stuff really matters, and it matters at a local level as well as a central one.
Jeevan, I can see you nodding furiously for all that. Do you want to cover me some thoughts on this area?
I was going to say, colloquially, the times I have heard of out and out corruption has been at the local government level, and it has been to do with planning applications in particular. And that's an area where, you know, Hannah was saying, you know, you don't vote at the ballot box in terms of corruption. I would entirely agree. I would also say that most people wouldn't know who their local councillors actually are in most cases. And so when we start to see these decisions really being made, there is a huge scope there, not just for nefarious lobbying, but the kind of corruption we would see as being well beyond and past the pale. The rules, the standards at a local level, you would argue, would have to be stronger because the democratic accountability mechanism is weaker down there at the local level.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I think that the council auditors are much more powerful and watchers over of what goes on locally. I've been very worried by the decline in standards, which is at government level, which has been evident since the pandemic, at the sort of abandoning, for understandable reasons, of competition for procurement, the sheer amounts of money spent, all without competition, just basically just granted out of a central procurement process, which nobody knows what it was or how it works. And we're now seeing some other issues, not only the generic issue with Desmond, but also Lord Lister and his behaviour. And so I think that there are some straws in the wind that I never thought I'd see actually happening in this country. And we don't seem to have a system other than them being shown up in the media where we can enforce standards here. And in fact, the people who are meant to be enforcing standards are all beholden to the Prime Minister. And I mean, so you like about Boris Johnson, but he's not a man who's been well known throughout his entire life as a stickler for the rules. So to have him enforcing them seems wrong to me.
Thank you, Angela. Duncan, do you have the thoughts on
Yeah,
this?
I hope I've got the connection, but if it fails me, I've posted a link to our report last year on local government, and prompted by Angela, I'll also post a link to the report we published last month about PP procurement. I think it's really a helpful point that Angela makes. We generally have this discussion as if lobbying is always about policy, but it's not always about policy. Lobbying is often about government spending priorities. And as we've seen in all of the revelations around procurement in the last year, lobbying is also essentially sales promotion for products for those seeking government procurement deals. And if we try to understand what are the problems we're trying to deal with, which is one of the questions which came up earlier, I think it's important that we should see this through both those lenses. On local government, I mean, some of the things that go on, I find very hard to justify. You will not find councillors working for lobbyists, lobbying for an application and then taking part in that decision in their own authority. But you will find councillors taking part in a decision for which a firm is representing a developer in their authority, and working for a developer, for a lobbyist, representing the same client on a case in another local authority. And it seems to us that there is insufficient distance between lobbying activities and the decisions that some councillors still allow themselves to be involved in. And I know, for example, you can't be a PRCA member and employ members of parliament, but I think we need proportionate rules, or at least voluntary prohibitions on the part of councillors and those political parties that select councillors around what role they should or should not be playing in lobbying around planning decisions, not just in their own authority, but where that might have a bearing on the decisions that they're making in their own authority.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Just a reminder, if anybody wants to ask any more questions, I think I've covered off most points in one way, shape or form, apart from one asked by Sam Wilding. And it pulls across a lot, I think, a lot of the things that we've been talking about from different sides, and that's what is the one thing, and Sam's been quite specific, one thing that can be done to restore public trust in lobbying and lobbyists. Now, I would challenge that back a little and say, as part of that, do we actually think that the public understand lobbying and lobbyists? At CIPR, we've recently announced a partnership with I Have a Voice that is looking at an educational programme going into schools to help, particularly in some less affluent areas across the country, as to how we can bring political education and therefore political careers through to the wider breadth of the community and helping them understand the process. So what is the one thing that you think could be done in restoring public trust? Hannah, can I come to you first, please?
Sure. So I would begin by saying I think this is the classic British error, is to think that we can do one thing and it will solve a problem. It's the classic response. Let's just tweak something or make one change and we'll get there. And because so many of these things are behavioural and cultural and involve such a complexity of issues that you can't just do one thing. But I will set that aside and answer the question. I think you're right that this isn't something that the public actually spend a lot of time thinking about. I think the sort of scandals, allegations we've seen in recent weeks haven't, Angela can tell me if I'm wrong, but haven't massively penetrated beyond the Westminster bubble. But the thing I think potentially could make a difference is the sort of the powers and the position of the independent advisor to the Prime Minister on the ministerial code, because what you could have in that role is a really sort of credible figure who, if there's an allegation or something which looks like there's some kind of perception of impropriety, can step in and say, right, I'm going to clear this up by doing an investigation. And then somebody who had the power to publish the results of that investigation, and then it would be up to the Prime Minister to decide whether and how to act on it. It might be achieved by giving that person some kind of link to Parliament, so that they could publish their reports through Parliament, and you had a select committee or some group in Parliament whose job it was to take an interest in what those people were doing. And then I think you would have visibility that any allegation of impropriety would have been investigated independently and the results of that made public. And I think that would have an effect on the public, because they would sort of have more confidence that had been done. And it would also have a deterrent effect on ministers, who would know that is what could happen if they did something that potentially got too close to the line. So that's my there are any number of things you could say, but I'll pick that one.
Great, thank you. Angela.
Well, the fact is that we're not in that situation, and that the Sir Alex Allen had to resign because the Prime Minister refused to either publish the report about Priti Patel or act on its recommendations. We then had a period of many months without there being any advisor at all. And Lord Gelt has just been appointed with tiny changes which give the fig leaf of some kind of greater independence, but still absolutely no requirement that a report that he does ought to be published, much less ought to be acted on. And the fact is that when that's the example that's been given from the top, it doesn't encourage anyone else to think that the rules are going to be followed. And we are also in a circumstance, I'm just going to throw this in there, where I think that the austerity and the weakening of the state that's gone on since 2010 means that many rules are not enforced. The treatment of fraud and impropriety in this country is a joke. very, very few claims of fraud or scamming in financial services ever lead to any kind of enforcement. And so my answer to your, although I have some sympathy with Hannah's view that tweaking one thing isn't going to make a difference, I think a little bit of enforcement and some people going to jail might make a difference. But we're way, way further away from that than we ever were.
Jeevan.
Yeah, well, my top point would actually be Hannah's point, which is to say that on the one hand, you would have, I think, an effective sanction system to stop ministers doing it, because then ministers would act in a way that is more appropriate. But given that's already been taken, I think more transparency over meetings and exactly who people are meeting, so that the public can at least come some way have some kind of accountability mechanism. Because in one sense, I think knowing about these scandals doesn't help. The thing that would help is them stopping them happening in the first place, right? Like just knowing that these things are going on is not the issue. I think we really need to have on the other side is sanctions to stop ministers acting in this way, or even other public officials as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We seem to have lost Duncan. I think he's dropped. Duncan, if you're there, I can't see you on the participant list, but if you are there and there's another name, please wave.
Duncan's just come back in.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. Duncan, are you back with us?
Yes, apologies for that.
No worries. The joys of technology. I don't know if you put the question.
It's our world-class infrastructure again.
We're just asking the question, what is the one thing that could be done or should be done to improve restore public trust in lobbying or lobbyists? But then, and we've also been saying whether actually this is on the public's radar or not.
Well, Hannah was right in what she was saying before I went offline, but in the same spirit, I would say it's about a sincere articulation that government decisions are made in the public interest, and making it very clear and avoiding any signs to the contrary that decision making is made according to self-interest, either of yourself or of your associates. And I think that gets to the heart of the trust issue. It is cultural, and rules can only take us so far in addressing it.
Great. Thank you. I think one of it sounds like one of the consistent things what you've all pretty much answered to that is about this, the impact of consequences and the robust enforcement of any rules. And in all of the consultations that I have run with the CIPR Public Affairs Group members as we were shaping our paper, every single one came out, well, what about the consequences of not following the rules? And that seems, so again, it's another one of those things lobbyists are pushing for, and potentially from the government or the elected official side as well. So that becomes quite good. Andrew, to your point, if we have the stronger rules and we have maybe the right person or people enforcing those rules, then that becomes a stronger deterrent. One final question, or a couple of questions that have come in, and that's about dealing with foreign governments lobbying national governments or political parties. Should this be covered? How would it be covered? It becomes a completely different view to what we've been covering so far. So I want this to be something a little bit different. Last question, and I'm going to go to Jeevan first.
In one sense, it's perhaps less of a worry, because you wouldn't expect a foreign government to lobby a minister in such a way that they would respond in a way that'd be favourable to a foreign government as opposed to our own, right? There's no real incentive for that to happen. I think the worry might be foreign firms more than foreign governments. But in that case, I suppose the thing you really want to see again is transparency, and also kind of a clear delineation of if they're having a meeting with X government and a decision that they made afterwards would be really key. In one sense, though, I think we should be less worried about this particular issue. But I think there is the two sides of the issue. It's both a private interest, and does the minister or whoever's in charge have an interest in promoting whatever some foreign government wants? And I think the latter case becomes a lot less likely. So hopefully it's not a huge issue to deal with, but in the end of it all, sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Thank you. Hannah?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that, except to just an observation, something I was reflecting on after something Angela said earlier. She rightly made the point that, when money exchanges hands, that's when these things can be really problematic. But I think the other issue is about expectation of future preferment. And I think that, you could have suspicions in certain cases where, if something happened that was good for a foreign company or government, that on leaving office, a minister could potentially, or civil servant could potentially benefit from something in future, even if no money changes hands at the time. But I think the fundamental point is, as Jeevan says, as long as this is transparent, then potentially those things can be spotted.
Okay, Angela?
I think the revolving door point Hannah's just made is really, really important. And I would certainly like to see ACOBA have much more teeth. I'd like to see ex-prime ministers unable to take up sort of massively paid employment of that sort for longer, perhaps, or to have more oversight of what they do. Even David Cameron was saying that there wasn't really a roadmap for ex-prime ministers, poor man, during his evidence to us. So I think we've got to think about this, but quid pro quos about these things. If you're going to stop people going into very lucrative careers after they've been out of government, then you have to think about how to support the offices of prime ministers more effectively. There are some balances that you've got to think about here. You can't ban people from doing other things, but what you've got to do is think about appropriate rules within which they can then operate. So I think the 2-year period might need extending for ex-prime ministers. And I just think that in terms of revolving doors, again, ACOBA is a rubber stamp, really, as it is at the moment. And we learnt that it's been pretty effectively sidelined by some of the civil servants that hadn't even asked whether they should be sort of going into the private sector in the way that they have. And I have nothing particularly against him, but Francis Maude, who introduced a lot of private sector so-called expertise into the government, has caused a lot of these issues by bringing in a sort of private sector approach to the way that business is done via the Crown representatives, via government civil service reform, which has imported a different culture. And I don't think we've quite caught up with that. And I note with interest that he's now set up Francis Maude Associates, a company that he runs from his place in the Lords, and some of the people that were involved in civil service reform with him when he was a government minister are working with his organisation there. So I think that, I'm not trying to say that people shouldn't be allowed to make money with the expertise and experience they've got, but I do think that this is an area where we need to have a much more holistic look at the rules.
Okay, and Duncan.
Well, on the question about foreign interference, this is somewhere where I think we might see some movement in the year ahead. There's proposals around foreign agent registration, which is likely to manifest in some respects in lobbying activity. That's not to say that anyone with foreign funding or foreign connections is somehow illegitimate by any means, but there will be a greater interest in those connections being properly understood. Only currently the US, Canada, and Australia have restrictions in this regard, and at the moment it would be very easy to obscure that under the systems that we have in place in the UK. So, for example, and I make no accusation of wrongdoing here. I think it's all followed the rules as we have them. But it was only last year that the Times was able to reveal a man called Fedotov as the beneficial owner of a company called Aquind, which had been very publicly, through its director, been making political donations to a wide number of politicians and supporters of the government. And all due diligence, shall we say, and consideration around that had been in relation to its director. And even the registering company's house has only in the last month had put into the public domain the identity of the Russian Caspian Sea pipeline developer who is the owner of that business. So questions around transparency, around international interest behind endeavours that might be engaging with government, and the government will be making a decision next month, I think, on a proposal from that company, are likely to, I think, are quite likely to come under increased scrutiny and rules which will require a degree of disclosure that don't currently are not currently in place. I think that could prove quite instructive to how the debate around that question develops.
Can I strongly agree with that? And particularly it ties into the tax haven systems and the secretive beneficial ownership lists and offshoring. And I think we'd get rid of an awful lot of abuse and corruption if we could clean all that up. I'm not saying it's easy, but again, transparency and shining a light on who owns these companies and shell companies and all of that is really, really important.
Great. Thank you everyone for your contributions today. That's as the audience and also our amazing panelists, Angela, Hannah, Jeevan and Duncan. The one final thing that I think we should be doing, my one thing, is that we should not stop doing these sorts of events, the sort of lobbying that we are doing to improve the processes, to improve transparency, to find a way forward and hopefully avoiding a scandal in a positive way. So again, thank you everybody. If you are a CIPR member, don't forget to register your attendance at this session to get your CPD points. If you aren't a CIPR member, why not come and join us? It's awesome. Again, thank you panelists. We really, really appreciate it. Have a great rest of the day, everybody, and enjoy the weekend when we get there. Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Yeah.